Okay, we want to go ahead and talk today just a little bit about the Spanish colonies of the New World and how they developed. The first step in their development was the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors or conquerors. There are several notable conquistadors that we're going to mention today. The first is a gentleman by the name of Francisco Pizzaro. Francisco Pizzaro, around the year 1530, explored the western shore of South America and conquers the Incas. He did this with a relatively few number of soldiers, and the Incas were an empire of 9 million. The reason he was able to do this is because at the time he was fortunate. He arrived, and the Incas were in the midst of a civil war. So the army was out of the capital city of Cuzco, and he arrives, and he more or less tricks the emperor into letting him in, and at which point he captures the emperor and will eventually kill him. You have to understand the Incas thought the emperor was a god, and when Pizarro killed the emperor, uh, basically all effective resistance shut down. There was no leadership. It became disorganized, and Francisco Pizarro was able to prevail with a relatively small number of soldiers over the Incas and conquer the Incan Empire. Another notable conquistador is Hernan Cortes. Hernan Cortes explores really primarily Central America and conquers the Aztecs in the year 1519. Again, some of this is due to a little bit of luck here. When Hernan Cortes shows up, he comes from over the sea. He's pale skinned and he has facial hair, which seems like an odd thing, um, especially if you're Native American, because Native American populations did not grow facial hair. Enter a legend that the Aztecs had as part of their religion, the legend of Quetzalcoatl. He was the god who taught them how to grow corn. He was the one who showed them where to build their capital city, according to legend, Noctitlan, on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. But according to legend, Quetzalcoatl was banished by the other gods across the sea, and Quetzalcoatl was pale skinned and had a beard, had facial hair. So when Cortez shows up and he's pale skinned and has facial hair from across the sea, uh, the Aztecs, some of them, assume that he is the god returned Quetzalcoatl. On top of that, he has cannons and he has guns. And so, again, something that the Aztecs had never seen. And so the ruler of the Aztecs, the king, Montezuma, goes ahead and he is hesitant to go ahead and attack this new arrival, which would have been a normal protocol under typical Aztec tradition. And if he had done that, Cortez would have had no chance. But he doesn't, and Hernan Cortez has the opportunity to go ahead and gather forces from other Native American groups who ally with him because Aztec rule was not popular. The Aztecs were brutal, and a lot of the native tribes they conquered did not like them. And so they were more than willing to team up with Hernan Cortez against him. But another big thing that helps out Hernan Cortez is disease. The Europeans brought with them smallpox. And right about the time the Aztecs finally figure things out, this guy's not a god, uh, the disease really starts to take effect. And a lot of the Aztec population was pretty ill. And again, Cortez, with a relatively few number of soldiers, is able to go ahead and conquer a much larger Aztec force in the year 1519. Other conquistadors, Ponce de Leon explores Florida in 1513. Balboa becomes the first European to see the Pacific in 1513, in fact, gives it the name Pacific Ocean. Um, and they are the ones who really establish a foothold in the New World for the Spanish. Now, once the Spanish get a foothold, they establish colonies, and they base their colonies off of something called the Encomienda System. An encomienda was basically a reward given by the Spanish king to a conquistador who had conquered land for him. And we're talking extremely large tracts of land. You're not talking, hundreds of acres or thousands of acres. You're talking hundreds of thousands of square miles. Think in terms of a country. A gift might be Bolivia. So again, very large tract of land that he would give to these conquistadors. And along with that tract of land, they had the rights to native labor. They were allowed to use the Indians, the Native Americans, for work. On the flip side of that, they had some responsibilities for the natives as well. The conquistadors were supposed to help the Roman Catholic Church convert the Native Americans to Christianity. They were supposed to provide for fair wages. They were supposed to care for the physical well-being of the natives. This didn't really transpire. Really, more or less, what ended up happening over the New World is the conquistadors used the natives as slave labor, and they ended up um, more or less wiping out certain groups of Native Americans because the conditions were so harsh. And so again, not a good situation there. The one advocate for the Native Americans in this whole ordeal was in fact the Catholic Church, who tried to go ahead and make sure that the Native Americans were taken care of. Out of this, there is a class system that is established in the Spanish colonial New World. At the very top of the class system were a group called Peninsularies, as the name might suggest. They are from the peninsula. In fact, the Iberian Peninsula. Spain is located on the Iberian Peninsula. These people were at the top of the social class. They were your rulers. They were your viceroys. Viceroy is another name for governor in the Spanish colonies. And they were born and raised in Europe, and they just came over. Most of the time they didn't stay. They'd go back to Europe. They were Europeans. The next group were the Creoles. Creoles, again, were 100% European blood. They didn't have any native blood in them or anything else, but they were born in the New World. So a Creole was somebody who had a European mom, European dad, but was born in the New World. A Peninsulary had to be born back in Europe. Third group down, and this became the largest group in Spanish society, were the Mestizos. These were people who would come over and they'd intermarried. They had European blood in their background. They had Native American blood in their background. And they were your third down the social class. The next group, the Native Americans, almost didn't even participate in the social structure. They really kind of stayed on their own. They didn't want to play the Spanish game. And so they kind of stay out of it. And then at the very bottom of the class system would be your slaves, primarily from Africa. And even within that, there was a ranking. There were the slaves, and then there were the freed slaves. Freed slaves would be slightly higher up than a slave. And as you might imagine, again, this is a pretty rigid class system. A Native American really couldn't move up within his lifetime. The only way you moved up was with your kids if they married, and you could be, your kids could be mestizos. For mestizos, there was no way to move up. There was no way you could ever be all European. For Creoles, again, maybe you could move up if you moved back to Europe and your kid then was a peninsulary. But for you yourself, there was no chance. And so it's a relatively rigid class system with little chance for advancement.